Welcome back to the podcast, Mike. It's good to have you back on for one of these Hacka conversations, Hacka Convo.
Yeah, one of the two times I come on per year, even though we're supposed to, do this every month.
Yeah.
Mostly my
Some
fault, by the way.
yeah. Well, sometimes it's both of our faults, but it's good to have you on, and we want to make sure to get this one in. We got a big day coming up for the both of us. I don't know if anyone has heard that the Kansas City Chiefs are in the Super Bowl again.
Third time in 4 years?
Let's go. Last time we talked about this on the pod was before the Bengals in the AFC Championship game. So that didn't work out well.
Yeah, a lot happier this time.
Yeah. Yeah. Hopefully the result is better once we get off this one. But yeah, it's good to have them back. A couple of years ago, you were actually able to come down to Australia to visit. And it just so happened that as the storybook would go, the Chiefs made the Super Bowl for the very first time, and we were able to watch that together. That was a really awesome memory that we had together.
Yeah, I still got that video saved on my phone of us and Pastor Harvey and everybody else who was there.
Yeah, yeah, it was like there was some anxious times during that first Super Bowl. I'm going to be a
Yeah,
lot more relaxed this year.
pretty much the first 3.5 quarters.
uh, I got some boys coming over, so we'll see if we can. It's Super Bowl Monday over here, so it doesn't coincide with church. We don't have to worry about that, but we do have to worry about work. So that's the issue over
Yeah.
here in Australia. But yeah, so looking forward to that. But it's good to have you back on. For those of you who may not, we've got a lot of new listeners, as I say almost every time we do one of these,
Yeah,
because we're
it's
not
exciting.
doing them. Yeah, well, we're not doing them as frequently as we'd like, but we can do it when we're able to. And yeah, we have a whole bunch of new listeners, so you may not have heard one of these before, but this is just an impromptu conversation that Mike and I have. And Mike is my older brother. He lives in Ohio, and I'm over here in Sydney. But that's why we call it the Hacka Combo, because it's two hackathorns talking about faith and different topics. So today, typically what we do is Mike will pick a topic that we'll discuss. And today we're going to be looking at Christian apologetics. And normally how we start these is Mike will introduce the topic, and then we'll talk back and forth about it. And hopefully you all will get something out of this conversation here today about apologetics. So Mike, if you wouldn't mind starting us off.
Yeah, I feel like I say this every single time, but this is something that's near and dear to my heart. It's something that I'm passionate about. Um, I really got interested in Christian apologetics. It was quite a few years ago. I was working with a guy who was an atheist, and so you know, a lot of times you'll be talking to an atheist about God, and they know their stuff, quite frankly. And so you've got to be ready to have an answer, as Jude tells us in his book, in his epistle, it tells us to earnestly contend for the faith. I'm sorry, it's Peter who says we need to always be ready to answer, but Jude challenges us to earnestly contend for the faith. And so
Mm.
I made up in my mind from that interaction that I wasn't going to be caught without an answer. Um, and I feel like it's very important for this generation, especially. Um, you know, 20, 30 years ago, you probably could have gotten away with, just faith, just believe in God. And because most people at the time did believe in God.
Mm-hmm.
Um,
Yeah, that's
but
right.
here lately, it's become more of a trend and more popular to not believe in God, as the scientific community has shifted. And we'll probably talk about that a little bit later. The fact is that they do not have science on their side like they think that they do. But the opinion of the scientific community has shifted, and as that has shifted, the opinion of the world has kind of gone along with it. And so what I've noticed, one of the things that troubles me is that it seems like time and time again, Christians kind of retreat from this battleground.
Mm.
Um, we're content to just say, well, I don't have an answer for that, but I just believe in God, or I just have faith in God. And I'm not discounting faith. I'm not discounting trust in God at all. I think that those are pillars of Christianity. But Jesus does tell us to love the Lord our God with all our heart, mind, soul, and strength. And I think included within the mind is the ability to analyze, the ability to reason, and the ability to debate if necessary, as we see throughout Paul's epistles
Mm-hmm.
and through the book of Acts. Paul was more than willing to debate people. He was more than willing to show them in the scriptures where they were incorrect and where he was correct. It's not a pride or arrogance thing, but it's something where we're right. We have the truth on our sides, and we have to go into this conversation with that understanding. It's again, to a lot of people, and to my atheist friend who I was talking to, I'm sure at times I came across as arrogant. I'm sure at times I came across as proud. I didn't try to, but I'm sure at times it comes across that way. But we have to understand that's not what's going on here. We have the truth on our side, and we can be confident about the truth. And what I mean by Christians retreating from the battlefield for so long is we've been content to just say, we trust in God, we believe in God, and that's enough. Quite frankly, in this generation, it's not enough. And quite frankly, in any generation, it's not enough. We have truth, we have reason on our side. And so I think it is imperative as Christians that we learn to defend our position. And Christian Apologetics teaches us to give a wise answer. What I always tell people too when we talk about this is, don't be afraid to say I don't know. Don't be afraid to say I'll come back to you with an answer. I don't claim to have all the answers. We try to be as prepared as we can be, but sometimes you just don't know, and that's okay. That's fine. But I find it irritating and frustrating, to be honest, that we constantly retreat from this battleground back into a shell that basically just says, well, we just believe in the Bible, or we just believe in faith. I don't believe in the Bible just because I have faith. That's blind faith. That's incorrect. That's inaccurate. I believe in the Bible because it has stood up over thousands of years of people trying to debase it. It is probably the most, it's not even probably, it is without a doubt the most challenged book in all of history.
Yeah,
and yet
sure.
the Bible has consistently and constantly stood up to the scrutiny. It stood up to archaeology. It stood up to science. It stood up to history. It stood up to all of these things. And quite frankly, there are still very, very many scholars today who believe in the Bible. Now, they'll get painted as being crazy, or they'll get painted as being biased. But the reality is, they believe in the Bible because they've done the research, they've looked into it, and it makes the most sense. It has the best argument. And so
Well, I think a lot of it also is with the intellectual crowd, or even not even the intellectuals anymore, but people who went to school, or people who just don't have faith. They may be agnostic, or someone that you're talking with, they actually don't have much of an understanding of what we believe, and not even what we believe, but the historical validation to what we believe. Like, for example, I was listening to this Christian podcast, and they were talking about how Joe Rogan had this guy on his podcast, and this guy was telling him about how he converted to Christianity, become a Christian, believed in the power of prayer and all of that. And some of the stuff that he was sharing to Rogan about the validity of the historical Jesus, that there's more proof that Jesus existed than any other historical figure. Like, if you're, and we're talking about ancient history, not people 100 years ago, but we're talking about like ancient history. If you're trying to compile records of someone existing or not existing, there is far more proof that Jesus actually was a real person that actually existed on the earth than there is for Aristotle, than there is for Socrates, there is for Plato, any of these philosophers, Julius Caesar, Alexander the Great. I mean, we can go on and on. There's way more proof for Jesus, but most people don't know that. Like if you're talking to someone, they think it's just the Bible. It's like, well, no, the Bible counts as something. Like that's those are historical books. 4 of them are historical books that are literally just written about Jesus' life. You don't have that for any of those other guys that we were just talking about. So there's a lot more proof than for the existence of Jesus, let alone our faith, our belief system, the supernatural, so on and so forth, than most of the people that you're going to talk to even know or understand. Like they were trying to say, he brought up the point that the Gospels were written within, I think Rogan brought up the point that the Gospels weren't written, it was like 100 years or so, or within 100 years, but it was like decades later, he said. And it's like, yeah, but decades when it comes to ancient history is like hours. Like if something is written decades later that from a historical event, and we have documented proof that is a real document and it really existed, it was written at that time, like that's like mere hours when you're looking at historical documents. And most people don't understand that context. They don't understand the context that there's only a few documents in existence that prove the Iliad was written. And, so, and we've got way more manuscripts for the New Testament, way more manuscripts for the Old Testament than for a document like the Iliad or a lot of these different stories. A lot of people don't know that. And so as Christians, it's incumbent upon us to know these things, to be able to share that with them. And then they start seeing the overwhelming evidence. It's not just a faith thing. Yes, faith is absolutely necessary, but there's other parts to this.
Yeah, it's like, I think faith and reason go together. And I think one of the problems is our generation has tried to separate faith and reason to make it to where you either have faith or you have reason. And that's ludicrous. That's absolutely ridiculous.
Well, that's never happened before. Yeah.
Yeah. Faith and reason go together 100%. It's like you and I have talked about. There are, just for an example, the Old Testament where it talks about the Exodus of Israel. For whatever reason, people discount the biblical account and go with the Egyptian account. And so, the big argument is they don't even know if the Exodus happened because the Egyptian account doesn't mention it. Well, here's where you use analytical reason. What reason would the Egyptians have to account for the Exodus? Why would they even want to mention that? It was humiliating. It was embarrassing to them. Why would they even want to mention that in their records? The problem that people have with calling the Bible history is the supernatural element. So we have decided that the supernatural doesn't exist anymore, right? We're too learned for that. We're too smart for that. We have too much understanding for that. But the reality is the Bible is accurate history as long as you can't discount the supernatural. And no one can discount the supernatural. To discount the supernatural, you have to first assume that the supernatural does not exist. And so the reality is there's no reason to not believe the supernatural elements of the Bible. There's no reason to discount that Jesus was a miracle worker. For instance, Jewish accounts, quite frankly, state that Jesus was a miracle worker. They just say that he was like a wizard or a warlock or something like that. But they don't deny the miraculous power that he had. That's Jewish accounts. That's not just the Bible. That's Jewish accounts. Roman accounts talk about Jesus of Nazareth and his teachings. And so, like you said, there's absolutely no reason to not believe in the historical Jesus. The only reason you would not believe in the historical Jesus is because you go to the conversation already not wanting to accept the historical Jesus.
I think that's a good point that you made there about the supernatural. Like if the problem is a lot of the people that you're going to be speaking to, and we do it even sometimes ourselves, is that we look at everything through a naturalist lens. And what that means is like we're trying to explain everything from a natural means. Like, how did this naturally happen? How did this occur? And so we pigeonhole God, or we try and explain away any sort of supernatural occurrence or any sort of thing that would be explained outside of nature. And if you continue to not look for something, if you continue to look for something else, lo and behold, you're going to start finding something else more than you're going to find the thing that you're not looking for. So if you're
Right.
constantly trying to figure out a way to discount the supernatural and figure out a way to explain it naturally, well, then you're going to continue to see things in a natural way as opposed to a supernatural. So like when something happens, like say you pray for a parking space and then a parking space opens up. Well, someone who walks by faith, who actually believes that, like my mother-in-law, she actually prays for them. And she is notorious for getting spots close to like not having to walk, getting spots when we're not able to. I know this is a simple example, but she is a woman of faith. She believes that her
Absolutely.
prayers matter. When she's praying for that, something happens. Someone like me who is a bit more of a pessimist when it comes to these sorts of things, like, well, you just happen to get a spot. But if you're constantly looking at it from a natural, that's my point. If you're looking at it from a natural perspective, then you're going to always try and figure out a way to explain away a supernatural occurrence in a natural way, as opposed to opening up your mind and understanding to, hey, maybe there's a supernatural reason as to why this happened, as opposed to just a natural reason. And
Yeah.
I think that's a great point that you made there.
Yeah. I mean, one of the things that I'm very passionate about talking about with apologetics is creation. Um, Unfortunately, creationism has taken a hit from the modern secular world, but the reality is there is no better explanation than creationism. It doesn't exist. Guys like Stephen Hawking even admitted that. They've basically said that, basically what their conclusion is that they're going to try to come up with anything that's not creationism. Okay.
Yeah.
So they're discounting that immediately because they don't believe in the supernatural.
Yeah,
You're
it's not an option.
automatically biased. So what kills me about that is that then they'll turn around and accuse Christians of being biased, and we have God of the gaps, so to speak. That if something happens and we don't have an explanation, we just attach it to God. Well, no, that's not true. First of all, second of all, the reality is they do the same thing with the theory of evolution, the exact same thing. So if you're talking to them about it, don't let them get away with that. Call them out on that, because the reality is that they're using the theory of evolution as a form of God of the gaps. So basically what they're saying is if they can't explain it, evolution did it. And
Right.
guys like Richard Dawkins have essentially made statements like that. And so the reality is that they're doing the same thing that they're accusing Christians of doing. But here's a great example that has to do with creationism. So, what the common question you'll get is, if God created everything, who created God? Right? That's the big thing that atheists try to come back with, and they think that they can muddy the waters with that, and they think that they can confuse you on that. The reality is, there's a very simple answer. Nothing created God. No one created God. We don't believe that everything in existence has a cause. We believe that everything that began to exist has a cause. And it may not sound like a difference, but there is a difference there. God did not begin to exist. He has existed from eternity. And so we don't believe as Christians, and I hear this, and the reason why I make this clarification is because I hear so many people make this mistake, even in discussions. That they'll say that everything that exists has a cause. That's not true. Everything that began to exist, everything that begins to exist, has a cause. God is the ultimate cause. God is the ultimate in creation. He is supernatural. He is above nature. Therefore, he does not have a cause. And so that's just one little example right there. But that's where you've got to use reason and logic, because I've talked to plenty of atheists, and they will try to muddy the waters. They will try to throw in confusing phrases and stuff like that. Don't get set aside by that. Don't allow yourself to get bogged down in that. Think with reason, think with logic. It will not fail you.
Well, and even when that argument is brought up, the counter argument also is, okay, well then where did it all start? How did it begin? What was the first cause? If everything has, a cause and effect, what was the first cause? How did everything come into being? There had to be a start at some point, right?
Right.
It used to be argued that there was no start. Well, that the universe always existed. Well, now that that's been proven to not be true, that there actually was a beginning to the universe. So then how did it begin? At some point, there had to be something that caused it, or
an ultimate cause.
Exactly. It couldn't just appear out of nowhere. And then you start getting these arguments about multiverse and how there's, all these different universes and we're just in one that happens to exist the way that it does, but there's other universes that are very similar to this. Of course not. But and you're taking that by faith, and you're listening to people with degrees say it. So then you're like, okay, well, they have a degree, so then that has to be, they wouldn't make something up when it's a theory. So they are making it up. They're opposing it as a possibility. But again, that comes from the perspective, as you said, that they're starting from the spot. There can't be a God. So then if there's no God, that's off the table. So how do we naturally explain how everything came into existence?
Right.
Well, you've completely cut God out of the equation if you're working from that perspective.
Yeah. I mean, and basically what I do with people like that is I just stop talking to them. You're not being fair to the argument. You're assuming. Now, I'm not going to sit here and tell you that you should debate everyone.
Yeah. I guess the point that I'm making there is not necessarily in a debate, but at that point, I'm sort of talking about the professors. So, like, if you're in university or you're in high school and they're teaching you these things, well, you have to understand that they're approaching it with bias as well. Everyone has a bias, and if they're trying to tell you that they don't have a bias, I'm not saying call them out, but understand that when you're learning, when you're in the process of learning, you have to get the good grade, you have to go through the class, you have to submit the paperwork, so on and so forth. But as you're going through that, understand that they are approaching it with a bias, and they have, as you said, they've completely put God as an option off the table. And so everything is a naturalist explanation, whether it naturally happened or not, and if it didn't happen naturally, whatever they're explaining is not true. So
so basically it's it's naturalism of the gaps then, right? So it basically, at some point you're going to have to ask the question, where did all this begin? What caused all of this, and who caused it? And so, we understand that if there is a design, there is a designer. And so, and people will try to pick that argument apart, but really they fail. They fail miserably when they try to pick that argument apart, because the reality is that we can see this in examples all over our world. Cars don't just pop up out of nowhere. I've never seen a car just pop up. I don't know if you guys in Australia have ever witnessed that phenomenon, but I've never seen a car just pop up. They're created. They have a design.
All the atoms just come together and form a car.
Right. Yeah. So we tend to think that that's how the universe began, right? It doesn't happen anymore, but it happened millions or billions of years ago, as they say.
Mike, it happens. It just happens over
slowly,
billions of years.
Very slowly. Yeah.
If you have unlimited time, you can do anything.
Yeah. Well, yeah. I mean, but it's like you said, anything but God will do. So and the reality, this is what it goes back to. And I actually said this to my atheist friend. I don't want people to misunderstand. I wasn't trying to nail him to the wall or anything like that. He was my golf buddy. I golfed with him. We were friends. We were legitimately friends. And I
this
think
is how guys talk to each other. Like we debate each other. Like if it's about sports, it's about politics or whatever. Like that's how we talk to each other. When, Yeah.
I also think it's important to have people in your life who have different opinions than you. They can kind of challenge your thinking, and you can be prepared. But anyway, what I said to him basically was, it doesn't matter what proof is shown to you, you're never going to believe. And I tried to say, I know that sounds mean, but I tried to say it in the nicest way possible, because what I was saying is, you could be shown all this kind of proof, but for you, it's not about proof. So as much as you want to say it's about reason and logic and science, that's not what it's about. It comes down to a belief system. You don't want to believe in God, because if you believe in God, then God gets to tell you what to do. If you believe in God, then then there is a reason to serve God. There is a reason to do what he would want you to do. There is a very real heaven and a very real hell, and you will spend eternity in one of those two places. If you believe in God, or even if you don't believe in God, it's still true. But basically what I was explaining to him was, you don't want to come under that. You don't want to come under that type of thinking. And so no amount of proof will ever do for you. And so that's basically where I would say, use a little wisdom there. I'm always willing to talk to people about God as long as they're willing to listen. But when they start shutting it down and, coming up with these crazy ideas, it's not worth it at that point. It's not worth your aggravation. It's not worth your time.
Well, I think the naturalist argument for how the world began had a lot more sway and a lot more validity back when Darwin postulated the theory of evolution, and as they were going through that entire process. But when people go back to Darwin and look at that and look at Darwinian evolution, which is what a lot of teaching is based off of, that was established prior to the understanding that the universe had a beginning. That was established prior to us understanding how the human genome works, DNA, the intricacies of the cell and of even atoms, like all of that. He thought of this when he was just looking at animals and different species and how different things could have come to being over time. Whereas since that time, we understand that the world is a lot more complex than we ever knew. And we've also gotten some answers, like to some questions that he didn't have answers to. I'm not saying he would have changed his mind. I don't know. But what I am saying is that you don't have to be stuck to a theory that is, over 140 years old, I think, or whatnot, just because your teacher says this is the best way to explain biology. And I think there's a lot of, you can hop on YouTube and listen to a lot of people with a lot more wisdom and understanding than us talk about apologetics or talk about science from a Christian perspective. The intelligent design group, there's a group of guys who are insanely smart who talk about this and talk about how going all the way down into the microscopic details of your body, there is signs of design. There is signs of intricacy. There is signs of even machine-like things in information. DNA is information. So you see all of this, and then
huge.
Exactly. When you look at it and you say, "In the beginning was the Word. Word was with God. The Word is what created everything," and then you see how the world is held up by the Word, framed by the Word, and you start connecting these things like, wow, that makes a lot more sense than a bunch of animals developing over time, over millions and it would be millions of years, or molecules developing over billions of years.
Millions, billions, trillions, take your pick.
Well, John Lennox, he argues against the different. There's evolution. There's what's considered microevolution, and then there's macroevolution. And so I believe microevolution is small changes over time within a species. Macroevolution is everything started from one thing and developed over time into everything that we have now. And he argues, and I tend to side with him on a lot of things, but he argues that, microevolution, there's a lot of proof for that. And that's adaptation. That's, that's why people are taller in certain areas, shorter in certain areas. the skin tones are different. Animals, different animals adapt to their environments, that sort of thing. But there's a big difference between that and then species begetting species, or these forks in the road that take place in development. Anyway, that got a little complex, but I guess what I was trying to say is that there's a lot more intricacy to the argument now than when the theory of evolution was first put out there. And so I guess my goal here in this conversation is to try and encourage people to, as you said at the start, don't walk away from the conversation. Don't allow someone, just because they have a degree, to tell you what you can and cannot believe, that you're foolish because you believe something. When, if you actually look at it and you read and you study, you're going to come to the realization that there are very smart people that have a lot of degrees that agree with you. And so, you're not by yourself on that sense. But the degree doesn't matter at the end of the day. What matters is truth, and are the arguments being put forward as logical as they try and make you believe, or is there bias involved? And so different things are not even considered. They're not even welcome in the conversation.
Yeah, it's Richard Dawkins is a great example. The guy is very, very smart. He's probably got more degrees than a thermometer. But when it comes to, the guy doesn't even really know what Christians believe. He accuses Christians of having blind faith. No Christian that I know, no real Christian that I know, has blind faith. We don't just believe in stuff to believe in it. We have reasons for believing, just like he has reasons for believing in evolution. And so, again, it's like you said, you can't get caught in the weeds here. You gotta realize these people, as smart as they are, they have biases as well. They have agendas as well. They have things that they're trying to do as well. And just because they're really, really smart doesn't mean that they don't have blind spots. They clearly have blind spots. And you and I have talked about other brilliant men, and we won't chase this rabbit trail, but just for an example, other brilliant men, theologians who are incredibly smart, who believe in a Trinity. And when there's no biblical basis for a Trinity whatsoever, it's not there. So the reality is that people can be really, really smart, but they can also not think logically, not use logic all the way through their thinking process. And here's the other thing I wanted to say.
Well, before you go into that, I think that's a good point as far as like bringing assumptions to the conversation. Like you'll see animals in Australia, for example. There's animals in Australia, and they'll look at those and they're like, oh, those prove that evolution is true, or that macroevolution is true, because you like a duck-billed platypus or something. And so it's a platypus with a duck bill. It's like, oh, that's kind of like, but you wouldn't consider that if you didn't bring your assumption to the conversation. The features are very similar to a few different species, but what they're bringing to the table is that this theory is true. So then I'm trying to find everything to prove that this theory is true. And it's similar to, I think we had this conversation about the Trinity, which we won't go into detail there. But if you bring the belief that the triune God exists to the Bible, then you're going to try and find proof for it throughout the Bible.
Find all kinds of evidence in your own mind for it.
So you'll read a passage where Jesus is praying to the Father, and you're like, oh, look, see, that's two different persons speaking to each other within the Trinity. And you'll see a passage in Genesis where it says, let us make man in our image, and you automatically assume that's talking about three persons wanting to create man. But if you don't have the idea of the Trinity, and you just go to the book, you just go to the Bible without any preconceived idea of who God is, and you read the Bible for what it is, you're not going to come to a triune God by the time you get to Revelation.
Right.
You're just not. You're going to come to the realization that Jesus was God manifest in flesh, and that you can be filled with the Spirit of God. But anyway, so it's the same thing when it comes to evolution. If you come to biology with the assumption that evolution is true, then you're going to start seeing it. And you're trying to, and we can do similar things as you talk about the God of the gaps. You come to the argument, God did everything. And so if you can't explain it, God did it.
Hmm.
And as you said at the beginning, it's very similar to it's naturalism of the gaps. I can't explain it. Naturalism did it, that sort of thing. But yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
Anyway,
Yeah, I
I
mean,
hope you haven't forgotten your second point there.
oh no, I'm good. But what I was going to say is we were talking about Darwin, and shocker, Darwin was not an atheist. There's actually no proof that Darwin was an atheist. There's no proof that Darwin was denying God in his entire origin of species. That actually came later. And so what the scientific community has done over the last 100 or so years has weaponized the theory of evolution and tried to use it against creationists and tried to use it against people who believe in God. Um, as far as my research has shown me, that was never Darwin's intent. But like you said, I think with the developments in science that we've seen, the fact that DNA is actually coding, it's like a computer programming. DNA is not just random information; it is organized information that structures your body in a certain way. Your brain is unbelievable, almost works like a computer. You look at some of these great technological innovations, and you look at them and go, man, how did people create that? Your brain created that. Someone's brain created that. And so the reality is that when you have this information, when you look at this, this information was actually input into our systems. You were referencing the intelligent design guys. Those guys are incredible. Some of the stuff I've read by them, guys like John Lennox are phenomenal. William Lane Craig, these guys are brilliant. Stephen Meyer. Yeah, these guys are absolutely brilliant, but they don't get the credit they deserve because people in the scientific community basically excommunicate them because they don't believe in the theory of evolution. They believe in a creator God who caused the universe to exist. So I don't get caught up in the scientific community. And here's the last point I wanted to make. We have often, I was talking about earlier how we've basically been taught that it's faith or reason. We've also been taught that it's Christianity or science. That is absolutely untrue. I cannot overstate or state enough how untrue that is. And it's one of the things that really frustrates me. Science proves God. It doesn't stand in contrast to God. It doesn't stand in contrast to the Bible. As a matter of fact, the way that science got its start was because a bunch of Christians, a bunch of people who believed in God, wondered about how the universe came into existence. That is how science started. They looked at the world around them and said, God caused all of this. Now, how did he cause all of this? Now, how did all of this come about? There was no question to them that God did it. There was no question. Yeah. It was, what were the processes that he put in place? What were the things that he did to cause this to come about? That's how we got the field of science. So Christianity and science, far from being contrasted against each other, are very much in the same realm and very much have to do with each other. I tell people all the time, I don't believe in the Bible just because I believe in the Bible. I believe in the Bible because I've had the experience. I've had the Book of Acts experience that I've seen for myself, works in my life and works in other people's lives. But I've also thought about logic and reason and science. And those conclusions have convinced me that the Bible is 100% true. And so we have to have both. Because your argument of, well, this is my experience will never hold up to a person who has not had that experience. But if you can somehow show them, look, God created the universe and God loves you, and you can somehow cause them to understand that logically, you can cause them to then take the next step to the experience. So now, because they've been convinced in their mind that God exists and God loves me, and I can see that in nature, I can see that in science, I can see that in creation, I can even see that in things like studies like mathematics, then that causes me to want to experience this God. That's why apologetics is so important. It's not to win a debate. It's not to make your atheist friend look foolish. That's not what apologetics is for. It's to convince people that this is true and that they can believe in and trust God.
Yeah, it's like the first step. And because there's so many different people with different personalities, some people will come to church just because you tell them that Jesus loves them. And some people will come because they're interested. Yeah, some people will come because they're interested in seeing what's going on. They want to experience an experience, Some people come to God for many different reasons, but there are a group of people that are shut off from us if we neglect apologetics, if we neglect the study of these things, and we're unable to talk about these topics, we're unable to address them in sermons or in teaching, we're unable to address it in our youth group. If we consistently avoid all these topics, those type of people we're going to continue to lose, or we won't be able to win them to Christ, because they want to think rationally. And I'm not saying that faith is irrational. It's not. But, and I think we spent 40 minutes talking about how faith can be rational. But the perception is that it is irrational. And so someone who thinks logically, someone who thinks rationally, they want to have a reason to believe in God beyond the experience. And so, and I know that's where I was at when I was 17, 18 years old, and I started my lifelong journey reading these books, studying these arguments, trying to understand. I started from a very simple spot and have learned things over time. But it started because I was questioning. It's like, this is the faith that my parents gave me, but is this actually true? Is this real? Like I would see things and I'm like, that doesn't make sense to me. And if you're smarter, you don't want to feel foolish when talking about science, when talking about different subjects. And so as leaders, we need to be aware of this. And as you said, don't walk away from the battlefield of ideas, but be engaged, learn, talk about it in your preaching, talk about it in your teaching. But if you are going to talk about it, make sure that you know what you're talking about, because Google exists, and Gen Z millennials will Google you in the middle of a sermon. So make sure that you're actually right in what you're talking about. If you go off the handle on a topic that you don't really know a whole lot about, and you say something and they know it better than you, then they're going to discount what you have to say on that subject, and they might discount what you have to say, period. Because you're wrong there, you might be wrong other areas. I know that's not necessarily true, but we have to be aware of that when we are talking about these subjects. Was there anything else you wanted to talk about as we finish up here?
Yeah, just my final point that I just kind of wanted to make was, when you're engaging in these conversations, I've heard so many people say apologetics don't work. It just turns into a debate. It turns into an argument. So, they've just kind of turned away from that mode of thinking, and that's fair. It's a fair argument. But what I would present to you is, how many times have you handed a flyer to someone and they've rejected it? How many times have you tried to pray for somebody on the street, they've rejected it? How many times have you invited someone to church and they've rejected it? Yet you still do those things. But for some reason, we become convinced in our minds we no longer are going to engage in apologetics because it just turns into a debate. If it turns into a debate, so be it. You have truth on your side. You have absolute truth on your side. There is nothing for you to be afraid of if you have done your research. And I would challenge, just to conclude here, just to wrap up, I would challenge you, read books like this. Read books that challenge your thinking. Read books that stretch your mind. For example, I was reading a William Lane Craig book. The guy's a philosopher. So he's speaking on a level that we don't speak on for the most part. I'm reading this book. I'm telling my wife, man, I literally have to read like half a chapter a day, because what he's saying is so deep that you have to sit there and think about it for a day or two. Don't be afraid of those books. That's how you grow. That's how you learn. Even if you come away with minimal knowledge, at least you have more knowledge than what you had when you started. Read the book again. Read it again till you start to get these concepts and understand these things. It's extremely important. I think as the century progresses, as life progresses, we're going to need more and more apologetics, not less. And so don't retreat from that battlefield. Don't give up on that, because other things that you've tried have not worked, but you continue to do them. Apologetics will not work in every scenario. I think we understand that. Jesus didn't have a 100% foolproof message either. But the reality is that if you try it enough times, you might convince one person. And if you convince one person, then it was worth it. Every book you read was worth it. All the research you did was worth it, because you were able to convince that person and show them the truth of the Word of God.
Yeah. And remember that when you are sharing this truth, when you're having these conversations, the Bible says to speak the truth in love. So if your heart is right and you're approaching these conversations with love, you're approaching the conversation with, humility, then that will appear. Like, I've seen debates between Christians like John Lennox and an atheist like Richard Dawkins. Both very smart men, both very wise, but John Lennox is a Christian and has a relationship with God, and you can tell it in the way that he talks, in his demeanor. He talks with humility. He talks with graciousness. But he also, if he needs to say a firm word, he does say that. But I think, keep that in mind if you're having these discussions. We are to speak the truth in love. We're trying to win them to Christ. We're not trying to just win an argument.
Absolutely.
There might be times where you're talking to someone because there's somebody else listening, and you need to have that conversation so the person listening understands that there is more to this than what is being shared. Well, this has been a great conversation. I always love talking about this subject. I could ramble on and on and on.
Might have to do a part 2 of this one.
Yeah. Maybe we'll do another one on this subject. But man, thanks for your time today. Thanks for coming back on the podcast. And as we finish up here, go Chiefs. Let's get that Super Bowl.
Go Chiefs.
Come on.
Love it every single time, man. Consider it an honor to even be able to be on here. Enjoy it every single time.
All right. Well, everyone, thanks for... Well, everyone, thank you for listening. And we hope to see you next time on the Hacka Convo on the Hacka Podcast.